The spotlight hit Dean Martin like it always did. Clean, white, unforgiving. The Copa Room at the Sands, October 1964, packed with celebrities, high rollers, and the kind of people who measured their worth in diamond cufflinks and imported cigars. The orchestra swelled into Everybody Loves Somebody, and Dean lifted his glass. Ginger ale, always ginger ale, though the audience would never know. And 1,500 people leaned forward like he was about to share the secret of immortality. This was the machinery of stardom at full throttle. The king of cool in his element, making everything look like nothing, turning effort into art, with that trademark half-smile that said, "Don't worry, kid, I've got this." To them he was the lovable drunk, the man who could fold a song in half with a joke and still land the last note in perfect, heartbreaking silence. But something was eating at him that night. 3 hours earlier, in a cramped office behind the hotel's kitchen, Dean had overheard a conversation that cracked something inside his chest. A charity coordinator was explaining the rules for tomorrow night's muscular dystrophy gala to a group of volunteers, working-class fathers whose children battled the disease, men who'd given months of their time organizing, fundraising, hoping. Black tie only, the coordinator had said, clipboard in hand, voice crisp with authority. No exceptions. This is a prestige event. We can't have people showing up in regular suits. Dean watched through the doorway as these men, a mechanic, a construction foreman, a diner cook, looked at their hands, their faces flushing with the particular shame that comes from being told you don't belong in a room you helped build. One of them, maybe 55, with calloused fingers and tired eyes, cleared his throat. "What if we can't afford to rent one?" The coordinator's smile was polite and final. "Then I'm afraid you'll have to watch the proceedings on television." Dean Martin had grown up in Steubenville, Ohio, where his father cut hair for 75 cents and his mother took in laundry to make ends meet. He knew exactly what it felt like to be locked out of a room because you didn't have the right clothes. The humiliation wasn't about fabric. It was about being told your worth could be measured by the thread count of your lapels. That night on stage, halfway through his second song, Dean stopped singing. Not dramatically. Not for effect. He just stopped. The band kept playing for 3 more bars before catching on. In the silence that followed, he stared at something in the back of the room that no one else could see. A vision of tomorrow night's gala, empty of the very people it was meant to help. Then he smiled. That trademark Dean Martin smile, the one that had launched 1,000 magazine covers. He made a joke about forgetting whether he was supposed to be drunk or just Italian, and the room exploded with relief laughter. But his mind was already somewhere else. Specifically, a garment warehouse in downtown Los Angeles where 500 black tuxedos hung like sleeping soldiers, waiting for a purpose their owner had never imagined. The coolest man in America was about to prove that true style had nothing to do with what you wore, and everything to do with making sure others could wear it too. Dean Martin spent his life making the difficult look easy, but stories like this reveal the heavy cost of that cool. If you want to keep the memory of the true Rat Pack alive, consider supporting the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support helps us uncover these lost legends. Now, let's go back to that cramped hotel office, where a conversation was about to change 500 lives. The morning sun over Los Angeles didn't sparkle the way it did in the movies. It hung heavy and filtered through industrial smog that settled like a gray blanket over the garment district, a world away from the manicured lawns of Beverly Hills. Dean Martin drove his modest Chevrolet through the cracked streets, deliberately avoiding the Cadillac the magazines loved to photograph. When he was working, really working, he preferred to move through the world like anyone else. The warehouse sat on a tired block where buildings slouched against each other like exhausted dancers after the last song. Inside, the air smelled of mothballs, starch, and something sadder, inventory that hadn't moved in far too long. Solomon Greenberg sat behind a desk buried under invoices he could no longer pay, staring at ledger pages that bled red ink. 30 years since arriving from Poland, and this is where optimism had led him. 500 black tuxedos hanging in perfect rows like silk-lapelled ghosts, ordered for events that never happened, galas that went bankrupt before the champagne could be poured. When Dean walked through the door, Solomon assumed it was a mistake. Men like Dean Martin didn't visit places like this. They sent assistants, managers, people whose job was to insulate fame from the ordinary machinery of commerce. But here he was, running his hand along the fabric of a jacket, checking the stitching with the careful attention of someone who understood the difference between appearance and quality. Dean didn't waste time with pleasantries. His voice, stripped of the Scotch-soaked slur he used on stage, was gentle but direct. He asked about sizes, about condition, about whether alterations could be done quickly. Solomon answered each question with growing confusion, watching this legend examine formal wear like a quartermaster preparing for battle. "How much do you owe?" Dean asked, his fingers still testing the weave of a jacket sleeve. Solomon hesitated, embarrassed. "More than these are worth," he admitted quietly. Dean stopped and looked at him with a seriousness that made the older man's throat tighten. "Not to me," he said. "To me, they're worth 500 men who won't have to stand outside a doorway feeling like they don't belong." The number Dean named made Solomon's hands shake as he wrote it down. It wasn't just fair, it was rescue. But it was the conditions that revealed this wasn't a normal transaction. No publicity, no press releases, no word to the papers. The money would be wired that afternoon. The tuxedos would be delivered where Dean specified, and each one had to arrive without any card, any tag, any indication of where it came from. Dean pulled out his checkbook, resting it on a stack of cardboard boxes. The scratch of his pen was the only sound in the warehouse. As he wrote, he began listing the specific requirements, not just any sizes, but the measurements of men whose bodies were shaped by labor, not leisure. The portly cuts, the extra longs, the broad shoulders of fathers who laid bricks and turned wrenches. He was ordering armor for an army of invisible men. Before tearing the check from the book, Dean paused and looked Solomon in the eye. For a second, the mask of celebrity vanished entirely. "If a single word of this makes it to the gossip columns," he said quietly, "the deal's dead. This isn't charity. This is correction." He handed over the check and touched the brim of his imaginary hat. On his way out, he paused at the end of a row, fingertips brushing the plastic covering one tuxedo, then another, like a priest blessing a congregation. Solomon, still stunned, finally voiced the question burning in his mind. "Mr. Martin, what exactly are you going to do with 500 tuxedos?" Dean glanced back, that familiar half-smile returning, but the eyes behind it were deadly serious. "I'm going to give 500 men back something nobody should ever lose, their right to stand in any room and not feel small." Steubenville, Ohio, 1935. The kind of winter that settled into your bones and made hope feel expensive. In Gaetano Crescetti's barber shop on South 7th Street, the air was thick with talc and bay rum, and 17-year-old Dino swept hair from the checkerboard floor while his father worked in careful silence. The bell above the door chimed whenever someone entered, a sound that had once felt welcoming but now carried the weight of judgment. The customer in the chair was Harold Thornton, a local magistrate who owned half the rental properties in town and carried himself like he owned the rest. Dino watched his father drape the white cape with practiced reverence, then began the delicate work of trimming around Thornton's ears. 20 minutes of artistry, 20 minutes of perfection. Gaetano treated every head of hair the same way, whether it belonged to a steelworker or a city official. When the haircut was finished, Thornton examined himself in the mirror with the critical eye of someone inspecting a servant's work. He stood, brushed imaginary hairs from his collar, and pulled out his wallet with deliberate slowness. The price was 75 cents. Everyone knew this. It was painted on the window in neat black letters. Thornton counted out 50 cents and placed it on the counter. No explanation. No apology. Just a shrug that said, "This is what you're worth to me." Then he reached back into his pocket and placed a nickel beside the coins, not as payment but as charity. "For the boy," he said, nodding toward Dino. He swept well. Dino watched his father's jaw tighten, saw the moment a proud man calculated groceries against dignity and chose survival. Gaetano nodded, murmured thanks in his careful English, and held the door open like Thornton was royalty. The bell chimed again as the magistrate left, this time sounding like mockery. That night, Dino couldn't stop thinking about the mathematics of humiliation. How 25 cents could purchase a man's self-respect. How his father had to smile while being robbed. The immigrant code his parents lived by, never complain, just work harder, suddenly felt less like dignity and more like a cage built from other people's expectations. By 18, Dino was dealing blackjack in the shadow world of Steubenville's gambling houses, watching the same lesson play out nightly. The wealthy men who lost hundreds laughed it off. The working men who lost 20 went home with shame carved into their faces. But it was the dress codes that fascinated him most, how a drunk millionaire in a tuxedo was welcomed while a sober factory worker in a clean but inexpensive suit was turned away. The breaking point came when he watched the house manager fire Tommy Benedetto for showing up in a jacket with a mended shoulder seam. Tommy's crime wasn't incompetence, it was visible poverty. The wealthy players, the manager explained, expected a certain atmosphere. Tommy's struggle was showing, and visibility was unacceptable. Walking home through the frozen streets that night, his tips folded in his pocket, Dino felt something harden inside his chest. The world was a stage, and everyone was judged by their costume. If you couldn't afford the right outfit, you simply ceased to exist in rooms that mattered. He made himself a promise that felt almost like a prayer. If he ever had the power to rewrite these invisible rules, he would remember this moment. He would remember Tommy's face, his father's silence, the weight of that nickel on the counter. 30 years later, standing in Solomon Greenberg's warehouse, Dean Martin was finally keeping that promise. The boy from Steubenville had never forgotten what it felt like to watch dignity get auctioned off for pocket change. The night before the gala, Los Angeles breathed with two different rhythms. Up in the hills where the air tasted of jasmine and ambition, the wealthy prepared for another evening of charitable theater. But down in the sprawling neighborhoods where streetlights fought losing battles against the dark, a different kind of preparation was about to begin, one that would arrive without warning and change everything. Dean Martin sat in his hotel suite, nursing a ginger ale he didn't want, staring at a telephone that held the power to confirm or condemn his gamble. Across the city, his assistant Richard drove through the maze of working-class streets with a van full of carefully wrapped packages and a handwritten list of addresses. Dean's instructions had been precise: no names, no explanations, no fanfare. Just deliver dignity to doorsteps and disappear into the night. The first stop was a modest house in Boyle Heights where Frank Kowalski lived with his wife Maria and their 3 daughters. Frank's hands bore the permanent stains of transmission fluid and engine grease, badges of honest work that no amount of scrubbing could erase. His youngest daughter, Marie, had been fighting muscular dystrophy for 2 years, and Frank had spent every weekend for 6 months organizing the charity gala, believing he was building something that mattered. Earlier that evening, he'd sat at his kitchen table trying to explain to Maria why he wouldn't be attending the event he'd talked about for months. Using the careful words men use when they're protecting their families from their own shame. When the knock came at 11:30, Frank opened the door to find Richard holding a long garment bag that seemed to glow under the porch light. Before Frank could ask who sent it, Richard delivered the message Dean had made him memorize. This is from someone who understands what it means to stand outside looking in. Inside the kitchen, under the hum of the refrigerator, Frank unzipped the bag. The tuxedo inside wasn't rental quality. It was real, tailored, the kind of formal wear that whispered elegance instead of shouting it. Maria appeared behind him, her hand going to her mouth as she realized what this meant. The jacket fit Frank's mechanic shoulders perfectly, as if someone had studied his measurements like a blueprint. Across town in El Monte, Richard found the home of James Chen, a construction foreman who'd built the stage for the gala with his own hands, working through lunch breaks and weekends. When James opened his door and saw the garment bag, he assumed there'd been some mistake. Men like him didn't receive deliveries like this. But Richard repeated the same careful script, and James stood in his doorway holding formal wear that cost more than he made in a month, trying to understand a kindness that arrived without explanation. By 3 a.m, Richard had visited dozens of homes, each delivery producing the same sequence of emotions: confusion, disbelief, then something deeper that looked like relief mixed with tears. In a small apartment in Pico Rivera, Miguel Santos tried on his tuxedo while his wheelchair-bound son watched from the living room. The boy clapped his hands together and said his father looked like a movie star, and Miguel stood straighter than he had in years, shoulders back, chin lifted in a restoration that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with recognition. The ripple effect in those homes was immediate and electric. Wives who had spent the evening consoling their husbands were suddenly scrambling for irons and shoe polish. Children woke to find their fathers transformed, standing in bathroom mirrors looking like different versions of themselves. The atmosphere shifted from the heavy silence of exclusion to the frantic energy of preparation. Decades later, one of those children, Marie Kowalski, now in her late 50s, would describe that night to her own grandson. She would pull a faded photograph from a shoebox, showing her father straight-backed in his tuxedo, one hand resting lightly on her wheelchair. "That was the night your granddad walked into a ballroom like he belonged there," she'd say softly. Not because anything about him changed, but because someone finally gave him the uniform the world respects. By dawn, Dean's mission had been executed with military precision. 500 black tuxedos now hung in bedrooms across Los Angeles, in homes that had never known such finery. He refused updates or thank yous. The only thing he wanted to know was whether the deliveries had been completed. When Richard confirmed it with a simple nod, Dean allowed himself one small, private exhale. Tomorrow night, 500 invisible men would walk into a room designed to exclude them, wearing armor stitched from black silk in quiet revolution. The Beverly Hilton ballroom had been dressed for theater. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across white tablecloths that stretched toward infinity, each centerpiece a small monument to wealth-performing charity. The coordinator stood near the entrance with her clipboard and her certainty, prepared to welcome the usual cast of society donors, whose checkbooks could rewrite lives with elegant signatures. This was supposed to be controlled, predictable, the kind of evening where everyone knew their role and stayed within their assigned boundaries. Then the doors opened, and the script changed completely. They didn't trickle in like apologetic afterthoughts. They arrived like a force of nature, 500 men in perfect black tie, moving through the entrance with the quiet confidence of people who belonged exactly where they stood. Frank Kowalski walked in with his wife on his arm, his tuxedo fitting him like it had been tailored for his mechanic's shoulders. Behind him came James Chen, the construction foreman who'd built the very stage now holding the orchestra. His bow tie straight as a plumb line, Miguel Santos wheeled his son through the doors, his formal wear transforming him from charity case to equal participant in a single breathtaking moment. The coordinator's face cycled through confusion, recognition, then something approaching panic. These were the men she'd dismissed 48 hours earlier, the ones she'd explained couldn't attend because they lacked appropriate attire. But now, standing in formal wear that rivaled anything the wealthiest donors wore, they were completely indistinguishable from the society guests she'd been instructed to court. Her categories had dissolved. Her clipboard suddenly felt useless. Dean Martin slipped through a side entrance, positioning himself at the bar where he could observe without being observed. He nursed his perpetual ginger ale while the room filled with an energy he'd orchestrated but would never claim. What he witnessed in those first 30 minutes justified every secret delivery, every dollar spent, every risk of his quiet revolution. The working men didn't swagger or announce themselves. They simply stood in the room like they'd always belonged there, which was precisely the point. The transformation wasn't just visual, it was atmospheric. Conversations that would never have happened began naturally. James Chin found himself discussing construction techniques with a studio executive who had no idea he was speaking to the man who'd literally built their stage. Frank Kowalski shook hands with bank presidents and casino owners, his calloused palms meeting soft ones in gestures of complete equality. The invisible walls Dean had spent his life hating, those barriers built from fabric and perception, were dissolving in real time. The emotional crescendo came when Frank was unexpectedly called to speak about his daughter's battle with muscular dystrophy. He climbed the stairs his own hands had helped construct, stood behind the microphone, and looked out at a sea of faces that finally saw him instead of looking through him. His voice carried the raw authenticity of a father fighting for his child's future, and the room leaned forward, captivated not by polish but by truth. When he finished, the applause wasn't charity applause. It was real, sustained. The kind that comes from witnessing genuine courage. Dean watched from his corner, face carefully neutral, but his grip on his glass tight enough to leave marks. When a society columnist approached, asking if he'd had anything to do with the remarkable turnout of impeccably dressed volunteers, his smile was pure performance. The drunk act slid into place like a comfortable mask. "Honey, I can barely dress myself," he drawled, letting his words slur just enough. "You think I'm keeping track of what other people wear?" She laughed and moved on, and Dean returned to his observation. The donations that night shattered previous records, not because the cause had changed, but because the people championing it had been allowed to stand tall. By erasing the visual markers of poverty, he'd forced the room to see the humanity underneath. The checkbooks opened not from guilt or condescension, but from genuine connection between equals. As the evening wound down, Dean left before the lights came up, slipping out the same door he'd entered. He didn't need to hear the final speeches or see the photographs. He'd witnessed what mattered: Frank Kowalski laughing with a bank president, fathers sharing stories across invisible lines that no longer existed, their tuxedos identical, their humanity finally recognized. The king of cool walked into the night air alone, lighting a cigarette in the darkness, the flame briefly illuminating not the superstar, but the man from Steubenville who had finally settled a very old score with dignity. The Tuxedos were supposed to be a one-time correction, a single act of rebellion against an injustice that had haunted Dean since Steubenville. But once you've tilted the world back toward fairness, it becomes impossible to walk away from the lever. What began as 500 black tuxedos quietly transformed into something much larger, a 3-decade campaign of invisible generosity that would touch thousands of lives while remaining completely hidden from the spotlight that followed Dean Martin everywhere else. The only person who witnessed the full scope of this secret war against suffering was Arthur Kaplan, Dean's accountant since the early 1960s. Arthur was a numbers man by training and temperament, someone who believed in clean ledgers and traceable transactions. But as the years accumulated, late 60s bleeding into the 70s, then the aching 80s, a second set of books began taking shape in his Beverly Hills office. Arthur privately called it the Shadow Ledger, a chronicle of money flowing out through channels designed for maximum impact and complete invisibility. Every entry followed the same rigid protocol: hospital bills paid anonymously through cashier's checks, college tuitions covered by scholarships from foundations that existed only on paper, funeral expenses handled by mysterious benefactors who vanished the moment gratitude tried to find them. Each transaction came with identical instructions from Dean: no acknowledgement requested, no receipt required, recipient must never know the source. It was charity engineered like a military operation, precision planned to preserve the one thing Dean understood was more valuable than money: the recipient's dignity. The pattern revealed itself in fragments that Arthur carefully documented. In 1967, a chorus girl from Dean's early Atlantic City days developed breast cancer. Her insurance covered nothing, and the mounting bills were destroying what remained of her savings. Within 48 hours of Dean learning about her situation, the hospital received full payment from what appeared to be a defunct performer's relief fund. The documentation was so convincing that the woman spent years believing some forgotten union had saved her life. She never knew, and Dean made certain she never would. When a lighting technician's son was accepted to UCLA in 1972 but couldn't afford tuition, an anonymous scholarship materialized bearing the official-sounding title of the Entertainment Industry Education Initiative. Arthur spent 3 days creating the paperwork, following Dean's precise instructions about maintaining the illusion. The family celebrated their son's good fortune, never suspecting that a man they'd never met was funding their dreams, because he remembered what it felt like to be locked out of rooms that mattered. One Christmas Eve in the mid-70s, Dean appeared at Arthur's house with a legal pad covered in his careful handwriting. Names and situations filled both sides of the paper: a comedian whose wife needed surgery, a grip who'd been injured on set and quietly let go, the widow of a big band saxophonist who died penniless after filling ballrooms with sound for 20 years. Dean spoke about each case with a specificity that made Arthur's throat tighten. These weren't line items in a charitable budget. They were human beings whose stories Dean carried like small weights in his chest. The psychology behind this compulsive secrecy ran deeper than simple modesty. Dean understood that visible charity creates hierarchies. The giver elevated, the receiver diminished. By erasing himself from the equation entirely, he protected something more precious than gratitude: the recipient's sense of agency. They weren't being rescued by a celebrity. They were being helped by circumstance, by systems that mysteriously worked in their favor, by luck that arrived exactly when hope had run out. But there was something else driving this need for anonymity, something Arthur glimpsed in unguarded moments when Dean reviewed the ledger entries. The giving seemed less like generosity and more like penance, as if Dean was trying to balance some cosmic equation he'd never fully explained. Every check he signed was an argument with his own success, a way of proving that fame hadn't corrupted the boy from Steubenville who remembered what powerlessness felt like. Then March 21st, 1987, arrived and shattered the careful architecture of Dean Martin's world. His son, Dean Paul, died when his Air National Guard F-4 Phantom crashed into Mount San Gorgonio during a training exercise. The grief didn't just wound Dean, it hollowed him out completely, aging him a decade in a single week. Friends watched the famous ease drain from his face like color from a photograph left too long in sunlight. Most people assumed that charitable giving would stop. Grief of that magnitude tends to collapse the world to the size of personal pain. But Arthur watched the opposite happen. The entries in the shadow ledger increased, both in frequency and focus. Dean began funding scholarships specifically for children who'd lost parents in military service. He covered grief counseling for families he'd never met, paying for sessions that lasted months or years, whatever was needed. When he learned that a crew member's wife had died suddenly, leaving 3 children, Dean didn't just cover the funeral. He established a trust fund that would see those children through college, structured so carefully that it appeared to come from their mother's life insurance policy. The giving became more targeted, more personal, as if Dean was trying to spare other families the financial terror that often follows loss. He couldn't save his own son, but he could save strangers, one invisible intervention at a time. It was generosity born from grief, charity as a form of prayer to a universe that had taken everything from him. By the early 90s, Dean's health was failing, but the shadow ledger continued growing. Arthur would visit him at home, finding Dean in his bathrobe, staring at photographs of his son, but still insisting on reviewing every charitable disbursement with meticulous attention. The giving had become the only thing keeping him tethered to the world, the only way he knew to transform his grief into something that mattered. One evening, long after the tuxedo incident had faded into memory for everyone but the men who'd worn them, Arthur tried to thank Dean, not for the money, but for the intent behind it, for seeing people the industry routinely forgot. Dean cut him off with that easy half-smile that always meant the conversation was over. "Artie," he said softly, lifting his glass of ginger ale, "you start talking about this stuff, it stops being about them and starts being about me. And I don't need that." They do. When Dean Martin died on Christmas Day 1995, alone in his Beverly Hills home, he took his secrets with him exactly as he'd always intended. The shadow ledger remained locked in Arthur's safe, a paper monument to a man who'd spent 30 years proving that the coolest thing about being famous wasn't the spotlight. It was having enough power to turn it off and work in the dark, where real heroes had always preferred to operate. Arthur Kaplan died on a quiet Tuesday in March 2003, leaving behind a Beverly Hills office that held more secrets than tax returns. His son David, tasked with settling the estate, expected the usual architecture of wealth management, investment portfolios, client files, the predictable machinery of money moving through time. What he found instead, locked in a fireproof safe behind a faded photograph of the Rat Pack, was a leather-bound ledger that would rewrite everything the world thought it knew about Dean Martin. The shadow ledger stretched from 1964 to 1995, each entry meticulously documented in Arthur's precise handwriting. Hospital bills, tuition payments, funeral expenses, trust funds. The amounts varied wildly, but every entry ended with the same notation: recipient unaware of source. DM insists on complete anonymity. This wasn't just financial documentation, it was a secret biography of compassion, a chronicle of the man behind the drunk act who had quietly waged a 3-decade war against the kind of suffering he'd witnessed as a child. The story couldn't stay locked in that office. Within months, journalists were tracking down the names in those careful entries, now elderly men and women who'd spent decades believing they'd been saved by circumstance. The interviews revealed a pattern of stunned recognition, stories that had seemed unconnected suddenly revealing their common architect. Marie Kowalski was in her 70s when they found her in Boyle Heights, still living in the house where her father had tried on a mysterious tuxedo in 1964. When shown the ledger entry documenting Dean's purchase of 500 formal suits, she went silent for a long time, holding a faded photograph of her father standing behind her wheelchair in perfect black tie. "We always wondered who sent that suit," she said finally, her voice thick with decades of gratitude that had never found its target. "Dad kept it his whole life, wore it to every important family event. He walked me down the aisle in that tuxedo in 1982, feeling like he belonged in a moment that mattered." The investigation uncovered dozens of similar revelations. The woman whose cancer treatment had been mysteriously paid for in 1967 learned that a defunct performers' union hadn't saved her life. Dean Martin had. College scholarship recipients discovered their success stories had begun with anonymous funding from a man who'd never finished high school but understood exactly what doors education could open. Each discovery followed the same pattern: confusion, recognition, then overwhelming gratitude for kindness that had arrived without explanation or expectation. Perhaps the most powerful evidence came from Solomon Greenberg's grandson, who found among his grandfather's papers a carbon copy of the original tuxedo order and a letter that had never been sent. In careful handwriting, the old warehouse owner had described the morning Dean walked in, not as a celebrity making a purchase, but as a man on a mission. "He didn't buy clothes," Solomon had written. "He bought dignity. He looked at my inventory and saw armor for the battle of being poor." In 2004, one of the original tuxedos found its way to a museum display. Donated by the Chin family, who had preserved it like a holy relic for 40 years, it now hangs in a climate-controlled case with a simple placard, gifted by Dean Martin to a man he never met, so that he might walk into a room as an equal. The final image isn't of Dean on stage with a drink in his hand, but of that empty tuxedo standing as a monument to invisible generosity. Dean Martin had spent his life perfecting the art of not caring, building a persona on indifference, on the idea that nothing really mattered as long as the jokes landed. But the ledger proved it was the greatest performance of his life. He cared so much it hurt about the invisible people, the ones standing in the shadows where he'd once stood himself. In the end, the coolest thing about the King of Cool wasn't how he looked in a tuxedo. It was how he made sure 500 other men looked just as good, knowing that sometimes all it takes to be seen is the right jacket and someone kind enough to pay the bill, expecting nothing in return but the quiet satisfaction of a cosmic balance finally restored.